I am thrilled to be here today with Ken Lowry. And I met Ken on Twitter, which is a great place to meet people if you have a curated Twitter feed, as I do. I, uh, I curate my Twitter feed down to just people that I find interesting or people that show up on my feed and commenting on someone else. And that's how I met Ken. I think you happen to know some of the same people that I know on Twitter. And what I thought would be fun to do today is kind of show people how I got interested in you on Twitter. So I have pulled out a lot of the comments that you made that I have bookmarked. And I thought then maybe you could kind of tell me what your thinking process was when you wrote that down. Now, it's kind of putting you on the spot because I know what it's like to make a Twitter comment. You only get 288 characters or something like that. And so a lot of times we think things through and carefully curate every word to make sure that it's going to make sense to us. But then we can sometimes forget what it was that we were actually thinking about when we wrote it. So,
Yeah. Well, and I might say really quickly then just kind of how I look at Twitter and what I'm trying to do when I do tweet.
yeah.
Um, there's times that I will make a comment on there um, that comes from a different place than where this is going to come from. This is kind of the ideal way that I try to filter most of my Twitter activity through. There are unfortunately times where I'm a little bit caught up in the moment of whatever thing, and so this is not. I'm sure this does not come through in all of my tweets, but what I try to do is you look at it as an opportunity to condense data formulation that's been from whatever I've been able to pick up in my experience of being a human being, and to the degree that I've been able to abstract meanings out of it, I then try to condense it into different packages, shall we say, these tweets. And that's kind of why I actually like the short aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just so on one hand, it's just trying to put that feedback out there. On another, it's trying to practice my own ability to use language, especially in a way that is concise but powerful, and also notice and also gain feedback for myself in terms of, hey, this is a word that has a lot of tension around it. And there's all kinds of different ways words have tension around them. But yeah, so that's kind of my uh, the lens through which I try to look at Twitter and tweets, things that I put out, especially things that I think are more interesting that I put out, are
Uh-huh.
probably things that are through that lens.
Well, it's a great training ground for sure. And before we go any further, you do have your own channel, right?
I do have my own channel.
And what's the focus of your channel?
It's called Climbing on Mount Sophia. So um, I primarily just started it because I was having some very interesting conversations with my friend Steve, who's been on several of those videos with me. And I wanted to share them with my brother and my dad and another couple friends. So I just thought I'd put them on YouTube, and then now I've gotten to have a couple conversations with John Vervaeke. So it's kind of a it's kind of become an arena for me to put some of these ideas out there and also have more skin in the game, especially with having conversations with people. And it also kind of, I think, can afford ground to move into a little bit higher level of conversation. Um, Certainly, there's been several people that I've had conversations with now that I don't know that I necessarily would have otherwise, because now I can actually approach them and say, hey, I have a YouTube channel. Would you be willing to have a conversation with me about this?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it gives you skin in the game. So that's the reason I have a YouTube channel.
Okay, and why did you call it climbing on Mount Sophia?
So I I think a lot of the ideas around the symbol are really, really. Um, I think that looking at reality as a symbolic fractal pattern, something like that, is one of the most powerful ways you can do that. So I'm very interested in symbolic language, in working with the idea of symbol. So the symbol is the symbol of the mountain is one of the central symbols in mythology, certainly in the Christian mythos. And I think it's a good one. It's how I actually work through the patterns of reality in my own brain, is this idea of Mount Sophia. So I try to take things like the Neoplatonic model of reality and the nesting of multiplicities into the one, and put words on that kind of a framework, and then play around. I think conversations were like playing around these words and trying to tie them together such that we can start to bring this mountain into view. So I think that's actually what Mount Sophia is. I'm not sure if I was clear there, but
Well, I think I understand. When you use the word Sophia, are you thinking of Sophia as wisdom?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Because I
And
mean, I know some people look at Sophia as being closely related to Mary,
mhm,
but you're thinking of Sophia as wisdom.
I'd say there's a lot of layers of that.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely wisdom is more the straightforward kind of tie to more the propositional way that I was just talking about it. But I think also that, yeah, man, yeah, there's a lot of places to go with Sophia. Um, and
Well, maybe we'll leave that for the rest of
yeah,
the conversation
I
because
haven't played around with that idea much, so
yeah,
it would be kind of covering new ground, but
yeah.
it's very interesting.
Okay, so I'm going to start with one of the quotes that I had picked out of your. I bookmark things when they interest me so that I can get back to them later.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah. So you said more recent exploration for me seems to indicate the transcendent God beyond the self is analogous to the deepest substrate behind the self. The waning post-enlightenment had a lot to do with the overemphasized reality of the material over the intellectual/conscious.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. Um,
Well, let's start with the transcendent God beyond the self is analogous to the deepest substrate behind the self.
yeah. So um, for me, making the Christian mythos existential might be one of the primary ways that I would say I'm trying to live my life and doing philosophy. So one of the problems that I was running into with that is, I mean, as always, the problem that you're working with is God, but one of the specific tensions that has gotten clear for me is in Christianity, especially in the modern Christianity, there's a fully upturned face. Everything is about God as other, God as far beyond, and then Jesus is somehow our buddy, and spans this gulf as if it, and the whole story is about what happens after you die and all this stuff, right? And that bothered me a lot because it seemed to be true that the closer I got to God, the deeper I was going inside of myself. So my God came near to me to the degree that I started coming near to my true self. If and when I say my true self, I'm talking about not not the level of self at which there is any identity, right? So not the level of self in which that is ascribed to a narrative position that is tied to this specific life. When I'm talking about the true self, I'm talking about the thing that's behind um, the narrative of my life or the particulars of this life. I'm talking about the awareness field or something, whatever it is, it's behind that. But as I got closer to that, it seemed that the transcendent Christian God became much more real in my life, um, both in sense, both in the sense of things like mystical experiences, and also in the sense of just my life starting to lay itself out for me in a practical way in terms of connectedness to reality. So I perceive, it seems to me that there's this tension in the Christian worldview where we're very strong on making sure that our God is transcendent, but we're not very clear at all about the ideas that Christ actually introduced, which is something like the kingdom of heaven is within you, and that, you know, the self is, it's neither I, it's no longer I that lives, but Christ that lives in me. Um, I think that the real Christian vision is the one that the a lot of the older, some of the church fathers and many of the mystics would talk about. In, I'm not sure who said it, but there's a line that's something like, um, God is both the furthest thing beyond that which you can imagine and closer to you than your own self. And I think it's the closer to you than your own self that we don't take seriously, especially from an existential perspective. We can do it if we make some kind of like Cartesian soul model, you know, where it's like, oh, there's the soul that's trapped in this body that somehow goes somewhere and it's different. And I just, I think there's this thing that's holding a lot of the Christian story back when we don't recognize the possibility that everything that the Bible says about the transcendent God is also actually, like, in a very, very real sense, true about the deepest level of the true self. And if you play that out existentially, it has some pretty serious implications.
Well, so what would be an example of a serious implication that would come from playing that out?
Well, that my to the degree that I am an individual, to the degree that I am whatever this is, you know, this kind of time bounded, you know, interface machine with a narrative, you know, all the stuff that Vervaeke puts together really, really cleanly of the machinery of what it means to be a self. So I'm relying here on Awakening from the Meaning Crisis and The Elusive I. But, you know, he builds out all this beautiful structure of what this thing we're doing here is. And it's, you know, it's beautiful and it's complex, but you can kind of map most of it out, and then you get to this thing called relevance realization and awareness, and you can't go behind those. And so I think that what it means is that if I get to the degree that I can open myself up, everything that I think of is in terms of myself as an individual, to the degree that I can open that up and align it properly, that God himself actually comes through this body, like as in the same way
Well,
that
I
he
mean,
did through Jesus.
that's what the word says, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what you're really getting at is taking God's word seriously,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
not literally, but seriously,
Totally.
right? So yeah, would that line up with the very, I mean, sort of simplistic idea of getting myself out of the way, getting my needy self, my sinful self, my greedy self, all of that stuff, getting that out of the way and letting God live his life through me.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what it means. Yeah. And so for me, the process has been taking each one of those notions, right? The notion of sin, the notion of sanctification, the notion of repentance, the notion of redemption, and taking them and making them really, really precise in terms of this is how it actually, this is what this actually means with the machinery of the self from the Vervaekian perspective. So that's what I'm talking about.
Well, so with the machinery of the self, because full disclosure, I have not watched all 50 episodes of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I've watched a
Sure.
few of them, And I've listened to John in enough conversations that I get the drift of what he's talking about. But
Sure.
let's take one of those things. Let's take sin. How
Mhm.
would sin be precisely calibrated in the Vervaekian way of looking at the self?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. That's so there's a way in which the deepest level of the self is, or the deepest existential starting point for everything is just the field of awareness. And awareness becomes actualized into reality by means of attention. And sorry, I just have to pick which models I want to talk about this through. My friend Steve does a really good job of talking about this through the models of quantum physics. Um, but to use Vervaekian language, that attention is both the means by which I perceive reality and the means by which I engage with reality. It's a bidirectional process. And I think this is probably the best way to understand what it means to be an agent is that your agency is actually simply where you place your attention and in which orientation. So, but the attention that actually flows through is something like um, God, the ground of being, because I'm using awareness as almost analogous with the ground of being itself, because it's the ground of being that I can get to. So, what that means then is that based on how that attention gets directed, all the machinery that directs that attention and the orientation by which it is directed, all that machinery, that's where sin happens. All this machinery of the self and all this stuff, apparently there's some ways that I can move that, I can mess with it, whatever, however I pull myself out of this connection to God, and this would be the state that Adam's in, right? Adam's in the state that all this machinery, which plays into this thing of relevance realization, all this machinery can actually pull relevance realization in a way that it's not free. And so I think actually the notion of freedom, when we talk about freedom, what the notion of freedom is really about is that the freedom of relevance realization to be unconstrained by my particular model of the world. So therefore, sin, because sin is the first move away from freedom, and therefore sin is the prioritization of something free above the freedom of relevance realization. So it's any move of pride, any move of prioritizing um, the modeling of reality that is held within the brain downstream of relevance realization, prioritizing that above the free movement of relevance realization into the world is sin.
So the free movement of relevance realization into the world before sin would have been uh, the move of the freedom to prioritize God's will and God's goodness and God's love as the lens through which we see everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is something like pure anagoge from the Platonic notion of um, or is it Plato or Aristotle? I think it's Plato, is anagoge, but that the reciprocally opening, always exponentially expanding conformity of reality with the self.
Well, so in the garden
Mhm.
with Eve, was there something already happening to her prioritization mechanism before the serpent said, "Did God really say?"
Yeah, so I think it depends on which level you're looking at the story, because this is, as far as I can tell, it's the deepest story that you can talk about. And you can look at it from so many different angles that any angle you come at it from um, it's also true in another way and from a different angle. So it's kind of strange that way. But I think of it primarily in terms of, well, where are you at in terms of the relationship of Satan to the snake? The notion of Satan and the notion of the serpent. Does that is that are those pretty closely overlaid in this question?
Well, I'm a learner more than I am a teacher. So I would be interested in your perspective on that. I know that there is a lot of debate about that. Um, I've read
Well, and I'm
some
not
people who
necessarily.
say, oh, it's simplistic to line those two up together. And, and yet, um, I can't name chapter and verse right now, but my feeling is that there are plenty of places in the New Testament where that is sort of taken for granted as an assumption underlying a lot of the teaching there. So,
Right.
without doing a lot of research, I guess I'd have to say I think there is some sort of an alignment there, yes.
Yeah. 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 And I guess I'm not. Um.
Now,
I'm.
when Christ is lifted up
Mhm.
and becomes the representative of the bronze serpent on the pole,
Yeah.
that is in some way him being willing to take on himself the the consequences of the prioritization of something above relevance realization for all humanity.
Yes, and it's a symbol
It
of.
does not make him Satan himself. It makes him okay, because I know that there are also people in the word of life realm who somehow line him up as a brother of Satan because of that aspect. So I mean, I don't go there.
So okay, so there's a way in which, but there's something that they're pointing to there, and it's the notion of the Satan and Christ interact on this on the same level with the human consciousness. Now Christ goes deeper because he goes behind it. Satan, but Satan is the level at which Christ comes into the human consciousness. Now, what I mean by that is that in from the standpoint of this machinery, I think that what the serpent actually represents is the I think it's analogous to Satan, we could say, but it's whatever function of consciousness avail tempts me. It's whatever aspect of my consciousness suggests to me that I ought to constrain relevance realization. Fundamentally, that is what Satan is, and what Christ, what Jesus's life was the new Adam, right? He's Adam reborn. He's the hypostasis of God Himself, right? He's and what that means from the standpoint of the individual existential man, what that means is that his relevance realization was never constrained whatsoever. And it's almost like an operating system. So you can think of Satan, and this is what happens at the fall, is the operating system of Satan is what became the operating system on the human interface, you could say. So that it was always like it wasn't a question of whether relevance realization was going to be constrained or not. You didn't know that it could not be constrained. Like that wasn't a technology that was available to us.
You mean
So
after the fall?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I actually don't think of it as being time bound. I don't that doesn't make as much sense to me. I mean, I can
Mm-hmm.
let it be that way. I don't need it not to be. Like none of the things I say are claims to truth
Mm-hmm.
because it's all just for me it's all just an exploration around the ideas.
Well,
So
yeah, I mean, I like to do that too. I like to look at ideas as a way to help me see new truths. And what you're talking about right now is very, very, very interesting to me. This idea of the freedom of relevance realization to be unconstrained, because that's exactly what I would call Satan the enemy. Okay, so that's exactly what the enemy does in me, is shift my relevance realization away from the priorities that would be the priorities that would grant me joy and abundance and life in the arena that God chose for me from before the foundations of the world. And when I shift out of that into prioritizing anything else, then it becomes reciprocally narrowing. It's just inevitable that that's going to happen, right? And so I'm continually constraining myself at the same time that I'm constraining, or at the same time that my relevance realization is being constrained into avenues that are, at the very least, unhelpful, not only for me, but for those around me.
Yes.
So I think that's really interesting language to use. Now, before we go any further, for those who might be listening who don't know what relevance realization is from the Vervaekian perspective, and I assume that's the perspective you're using,
Yes.
could you describe that?
Yeah. 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 So, I mean, if you don't know anything about relevance realization and you're listening to this conversation and you're finding it interesting at all, it's probably there's probably very few better uses of your time than to go and watch Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. That's John Vervaake's lecture series. It's incredibly powerful. But relevance realization is what I think John would say is the deepest level that we can go, at least so far, in our understanding of what it means, of what it is that makes us particularly human. From a cognitive science perspective, from a philosophical perspective, even probably from a religious perspective. That's actually the aspect that I'm trying to bring in here as we're talking about this. But what it is the manner in which your attention is oriented. It's how does something become relevant to you? How is it that I'm able to sit in a room or go outside and have an infinite amount of data available to me to look at or to engage with, an infinite amount of possible choices of what to do in any moment, all the time. And somehow I just know what is relevant to me. There's no way to get at how your perceptual faculties develop a prioritization of where to look in terms of your attention. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you can manipulate it, and this is really helpful in starting to understand how sin works. But from just a basic standpoint of how we work as people, somehow we are able to just find relevant what we need in this arena in which we live of the world, that it doesn't make sense. It's where we run into problems with AI. It's not computational. It's not rationality and this relevance realization thing. It's not computational, whatever it is. It's not a computer that's computing things. It's, because you can't do that. So anyway, that's.
Well, so, I'm sure you've heard Jordan Peterson talk about this as well. He comes from a slightly different perspective. But he talks about how each moment we're faced with a field of infinite possibilities. And from the postmodern perspective, that basically means that everything is meaningless because there are no categories. And Jordan Peterson says, well, yes, but if you've put your focus on that which is the highest good of which you can conceive, then it seems as though that highest good brings into your field of relevance those things that would be useful to you in making your way across this field and helping you choose a path and helping you get closer to the direction that you could be going or should be going. So Jordan Peterson seems to bring in something in addition to what John Vervaeke is talking about, because he's adding the idea that there could be some transcendent good who actively puts out in front of us those things that we need.
Yeah, and so um I wouldn't want to try to put all of John's eggs in that basket. Certainly, that's just
Oh no, I mean, I
this is
know
just a
John's
machinery
eggs
thing.
aren't in that basket.
Yeah, I mean he's unbelievably brilliant and complex. But yes, so if we talk about this, let's use the field of the postmodern, because so the postmodern for me, and in insofar as I understand it, is actually um it's the necessary place that we had to go from the fall. It's the so there's a way in which when we pay attention to whatever we pay attention to, we actualize reality. This is how our lives work. My paying attention and engagement with the cup actualizes me drinking water, which means I can't have not drank water, which changes my future trajectory in the world. And there's some manner in which the paths we go down in, let's say a decision tree of moments, um, end up actualizing themselves far downstream. The impacts of them do, because all of
Yes.
reality, everything, like for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so there's a way in which things play themselves out, and this is the lens of evolution too, right? That we play things out to their conclusions. And so I think that the postmodern is something like seeing the field of possibility, but being fully disconnected from it, such that there are no categories anymore. You are in Nietzsche's abyss, because you've constrained relevance realization to the point that it can't move at all. Something like that. Because what Peterson is getting at, and I think this is the really important point with relevance realization, is it's embedded. Your relevance realization is embedded in material reality, in a body, and it is constrained to hard constraints, right? You will die. If like if you everyone dies, and if you step off the cliff, you will hit the ground, and that will be the end of your possibility of actualizing potential. So your relevance realization is not autonomous. It's constrained in a world. And so your your actualization of the potential space happens internally first, right? Because what you're doing in all the time is your attention is intaking data, and it's building a model of reality. And then you can then and that's almost what your relevance realization goes through the whole thing. But in the manner in which you get to be an agent and maybe change certain things, it comes from the internal space first. So it's really important that you recognize that, because of the hard constraints, because of the embedded nature of relevance realization, the the emergence of reality through data intake has to be prioritized always, from the standpoint of the individual self. What comes in always is prioritized over what I can put back out, right? Because attention is dual. It's coming in and going out. So what comes in is true. What goes out, and what's done in here And then what therefore I perceive and project, it's probabilistic. It,
Mm-hmm.
it's not complete, so it's probabilistic, which means that I don't get to say what the categories are out there, right? I don't I don't get to make the rules onto the possibility space. But if I receive it properly, I can be connected to it properly. And if I'm in right relationship, if I'm in this ratio, right, the rationality, right relationship, in connectedness to, you know, this whole field of reality, then what can what can happen? I mean, I don't think anybody's ever seen the upper limits of that.
Well, so this is fascinating because I've been trying to find language for this for 30 years probably. Um, I used to call my idea experiential DNA,
Okay.
but I think it lines up with what you were just talking about in terms of the the data structure that exists inside of each of us. And that data structure exists there, near as I can see it, based on um, obviously your family of origin, the input you got from your mother and father as a child, every experience you've ever had, every song you've ever listened to or sung, or every worship service you've ever been in, every message you've ever heard, every book you've ever read, all of those things have built this internal structure in us that gives us a completely unique DNA like internal structure
Yep.
that makes each person a completely unique individual.
Yep.
There's
And
no
this is
one
what
else.
I refer to this as the construct. But
Yeah, okay.
yep. Yep.
So this
Yeah.
construct,
Existential DNA is a great way to talk about it as well.
my construct is different than your construct.
Mm-hmm.
So everything that I see from here on out, even if you and I are looking at the same thing, we are going to have a unique perspective on it.
Mm-hmm.
And we take it in with that unique perspective, that filter, so to
Yep.
speak. And then when we have output from that, whether it's something we're trying to say or, something we're trying to paint or cook or whatever, our output is going to be completely unique because of that.
Yep.
So I've argued for many years that because many of these things that it is vital to the health of the world that everyone participate in expressing themselves in some way so that that perspective gets added to the collective, so to speak, right?
Yes.
Your
Yes.
your
Yes.
uniqueness will be added to the collective because that's what fills out the universe when all of us are giving our unique vision into the world.
Yep.
But that unique vision can also be constrained in very,
Mm-hmm.
very unhealthy ways because some of these experiences or some of the input we've had is faulty. But that in the best of all possible worlds, this construct in some way is almost like a mesh network or something with little feelers on it that when it goes out into the world again, because I have so many little feelers out there, that there is a way to gather the world into myself that is good,
Yes.
which I think
Yes.
is what you're talking about
Yep.
in
This is
the
agape.
unconstrained relevance realization.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So
And
there's
so to me, what that's saying is that the construct inside of me has a way of touching the 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 internal beauty of the hypostasis of Christ,
mm,
where we are, where I am growing up into Him.
mm-hmm.
He is in me, but I am also growing up into Him. And as I'm growing up into Him, then these connections get made. But I have struggled to find ways to describe that because what we're really doing is getting in touch with reality,
Yep.
touching reality.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So there's so much here. Okay. So for the first part that you talked about it, This is the manner in which culture works. And this is that it's actually pretty straightforward in terms of how it works. It's just that what I perceive of reality, the model that my brain presents to my attention of what reality is the lens through which my attention can work with the world, right? Because my attention is embodied into reality by means of this body, this interface system. It's multi-layered, it's multi-dimensional, it's I won't go into that. But as such, my attention, which is what I truly am, right? What the true self really is in relationship to reality is attention. And so I become less of a real self to the degree that my construct in my head is not representational of what actually comes in to my interface, right? So the data that I engage with my interface, when it is it can be represented accurately. That's the ability of relevance realization and the modeling capability of the system. But I can also arbitrarily disconnect it. One way in which I do this is pride. This is
Mm-hmm.
to constrain relevance realization in such a way as to take all it is you say, hey, my construct internally is of higher priority than what feedback I just received from the system, and therefore I'm not going I'm going to disassociate from that feedback. Well, now my construct is disintegrated because we need
Mm-hmm.
integration. We need integration between there is no subjective and objective unless you have disintegration. Right? If you have integration, you have transjective reality. And this is something that John talks about. But
Mm-hmm.
disintegration happens when this is different than that. But that only happens when this is preserved at the cost of this. So anytime I'm trying to keep this in the construct, when I'm trying to hold it as something or keep something away from it or whatever, this is what it means to become God. This is why the serpent says God doesn't want you to eat of the fruit, because in the day that you do it, you will become as God, knowing good from evil. To claim the knowledge of good and evil is to prioritize the internal construct over the emergent revealing of reality into your interface, into your sonic
Mm-hmm.
body.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
I,
So
I totally see that.
and
Um,
and
it,
and
it
the collective
reminds me
space.
there's this old, I once was told by a Russian friend, this old Russian proverb, and she told me many years later, no, you got it wrong, Karen. That's not what it says. But it always made more sense to me the way I heard it. So it's something to the effect that the truth once spoken becomes a lie,
Yes.
right? That
Yes.
you can have this insight of the truth. You have this intake and you have this insight of the truth, but then once you start trying to speak it out into the world and it starts going through all your filters and you're looking at the other person to see how they're reacting and you're judging your own, your own thought processes while you're doing it and whatever all these things are that are going on,
Yes.
that truth gets corrupted little by little until that by the time it's completed out there. This is why Jordan Peterson says, I think, tell the truth or at
Yes.
least don't lie, because
Yeah.
telling the truth is way more complicated than you could ever imagine.
And this is what it means to climb on Mount Sophia. So to tell the truth or at least don't lie is, at least as far as I can tell, one of the first one of the most fundamental, probably, well, it is the most fundamental tool of climbing on Mount Sophia, because you can't play with words until you have the proper posture towards them. And the posture towards propositions is very, very important. So if my posture toward a proposition of any sort, any kind of, this is the problem with dogmas, this is the problem with um, this man, I mean, this is one of the fundamental problems that we have in our modern culture, is the tyranny of the propositional. as in the words of John. And that is that if I think a proposition is something that I can have, and then therefore I can wield, in order to do that, like it's technically wrong, because in order to do that, I have to have some sort of place to stand. And in order for me to have some place to stand, I have to have my construct prioritized above reality. If I'm going to defend a specific propositional stance, right, I'm going to say this is the proposition and this is exactly what it means. No, you can't do that, because then you become the reference point. And you can't
Mm-hmm.
become the reference point because you're embedded. Like you are fundamentally embedded in this reality as a finite being, which means that for you to hold on to one particular model is to commit original sin, no matter how beautiful that model is.
Yeah, I just got done with a long conversation with a testing equipment designer.
Mm,
Um, and we were talking about this very thing about measurement and the problems with measurement, and that basically the takeaway is the part always has to measure up to the master.
mm,
Whenever they do really fine measurement, they have a master that they're measuring against. It's always a comparison against something,
mhm,
and the part must always measure up to the master. And if
mhm,
you give up the master, if you destroy the master, or decide you don't want to have the master,
mhm,
whatever that is, then you can't build anything,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
Because everybody has their own protocol, everybody has their own ideal, everybody has their own measuring system,
Yep,
and
yep,
then
and
society crumbles.
yep. And so there's this weird tension that has to happen, right? You have to you have to have rules, right? You have to have dogmas. There's nothing wrong with dogmas. It's just you have to be able to look at them from all sides. And you have to be able to look at them, not wield them. Right? Like you do want to have, you know, structures, right? Because the structures by which because words are the main way we share construct, right? You use words to share construct, and that's what builds culture fundamentally. Our cooperative capability in the abstract sense is dependent upon our ability to share construct to each other, primarily by means of propositions. So it's really important that you have shared propositional space.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Um,
that's the key. It has to be shared, right?
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
measurement standards have to be agreed upon by everybody who's participating in the building project.
yeah,
And once that's agreed upon by everybody, then you can use that standard. So if you have a dogma that's agreed upon by everybody as the standard that under which you're going to stand,
yeah,
then it's going to work. But um, yeah.
totally. Yeah. And so, it's a difficult tension to hold because, like, take for example the Christian story. What I've been doing a lot with the Christian story, both personally and in conversations with people, is um, work within it and outside it at the same time. And that's really difficult to do because you have to hold up the dogmas and look at yourself in relationship to the dogmas all the time. But at the same time, you're kind of trying to problematize the ways, well, problematize the existential mismanifestations of the dogma, you might say.
Yeah.
And so, um, yeah, it has so much to do with posture of the self in relationship.
Well, yeah, I mean, being always aware of being always aware of my own personal tendencies towards hypocrisy, my own personal tendency towards constraining my relevance realization because of pride or fear or self-preservation or
Well, it's, I mean,
it's endless.
it makes Paul's statement of all my good works are as filthy rags actually makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. It also, it makes the notion of sin, like one of the
That's
things
the
that,
first verse I ever memorized.
yeah, nice, nice. That's a good one. That's a good one. I mean, I was thinking the other day that maybe the only thing worse than malevolence is self-righteousness, because at least malevolence is honest about what it's inflicting on the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so the,
And
you know,
I commented on your Twitter feed on that one
yeah,
because my husband and I had just been talking about how that's the problem with so much of what the virtue signaling governmental agencies are doing, are inflicting upon the world, because it all comes off as this righteousness of what we should all be doing, and yet the consequences downstream are so severe. And when it's righteousness like that, you don't have your antenna out to protect yourself against it. And so it just keeps getting done over and over and over again until it gathers a life of its own. And
yeah. Well, and this, if we go back to how we were talking about the postmodernist frame, this actually makes sense, because the postmodernist frame is that the construct is fundamentally disconnect from the interface, right? Like, it doesn't matter what data I'm receiving from the world. I am projecting the world onto the world all the time, and the value is actually that I express my construct, which is divergent, onto the world. That's actually the goal, straightforwardly. And if you read Sartre, like Jean-Paul Sartre, this is like, I mean, this is his, like, one of his central quotes, that man's essence is, or man's existence is his essence, right? There's no distinction between the essential self and the existential self. It's just that you create yourself into each moment. It's it's the pure imposition of the construct onto reality. So
is that where we get in trouble with utopian thinking?
yeah, this is why John is so deeply right when he says, um, neither utopia nor nostalgia, because nostalgia is the attempt of the construct to hold on to the past and force the past into the present. And utopia is the attempt of the construct to force itself into the future in a specified form, and thus not, thus distort the present.
Well, Twitter has been very good for you, distilling these big ideas into a small number of words.
Yeah, okay, so we got through the first line of the first tweet.
Well, let's take the second line of the first tweet. And if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to do some more of these, because this, I think, is just, first of all, it's very helpful to me, but I also think it's helpful to my viewers who sometimes struggle. I mean, I think we all struggle to really get a grip on what John is saying often. Um, Even many people who've watched the whole series,
Oh yeah.
and especially being able to hear it from you through the lens of a believer,
Hmm.
really helps. I mean, I have different words for all the things that you're talking about, and yet I can slot them in very easily to the understanding that I've developed over the years. So the second half of that is, I'm going to read the first half again so people just know what we've been talking about. First half of it was, more recent exploration for me seems to indicate that transcendent God beyond the self is analogous to the deepest substrate behind the self. And I think you said that that deepest substrate behind the self is awareness.
Hmm. Yeah, I think at least that would be. I don't know that it's. I don't know if it's the same, but it's the closest bridge to the ground. It's the closest existential bridge that I can actually like point to within myself to make it realized in myself, to the ground of being. that is,
Okay.
the field of of oh wow, what is it in Buddhism? The field of samsara? No, uh, wow, I haven't. It's been too long since I've been
Yeah.
reading my Buddhist text. But the same thing is the ground of being, the ground of the Godhead, for Meister Eckhart, all of that.
Hmm. So then the second half of the tweet was the waning post-enlightenment had a lot to do with the overemphasized reality of the material over the intellectual slash conscious. Now, what did that mean?
So,
Emphasizing reality of the material over the intellectual.
so there's a way in which awareness flows into space, into material. That's kind of what time is the flow of order, the flow of intelligence, the flow of um, patterns into potential. This is true from an evolutionary standpoint. This is true from um, I think this is how quantum physics works in a real sense, is that the ordering of reality into ordered patterns, and therefore higher levels of intelligibility, higher levels of life from an evolutionary standpoint, um, they come into being through this flow of time into space. And I think that's the way in which our attention structures reality. So as individuals, we are, from this viewpoint, we are something like apertures for the divine movement of time into space. And so, therefore, it's really important that both time and space are prioritized equally. This is, I would use these terms kind of synonymously or analogously with the notion of material and spiritual. Or for Saint Maximus the Confessor, this is the material and the intellectual. Um,
Wait now, material and the intellectual parallel what?
Time and
Time?
space. So space is the material, or the potential.
Space is the material and time is the intellectual.
Mm-hmm. So it's the abstracting, it's the functional patterning of the space, something like that.
Have you run into Wolfram's theory at all yet?
I know the name, and I maybe through John, but this,
Okay. Well, if you want another rabbit hole to jump down,
yeah, tell me about it.
there is a he's a mathematician and I think he's also got a physics background. He has a theory of, well, you could, some people call it a theory of everything, but it's his theory of, well, let's just call it a theory.
Sure.
And a basic of the theory is that space consists of atoms of space.
Mm-hmm.
Not atoms, but
Units,
smaller
you might say.
particles, much, much smaller even than quantum particles.
Okay.
He started out calling them atoms of space, but now he has a name for them. He calls
Okay.
them eames.
Okay.
So space consists of all of these eames,
Mm-hmm.
and that there must have been a beginning because the way that the eames lay themselves out is that they start with one tiny pattern,
Mm-hmm.
and then time updates.
Mm-hmm.
He calls time the updating of events.
Mm-hmm.
But the event is to take one pattern and change it into the other pattern.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever that pattern shows up, it is changed into the other pattern by time.
Mm-hmm.
And what that does is build out space into this structure that becomes increasingly complex over time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he and his team have done all the work on showing how that would work in what they
Mm-hmm.
call hypergraphs
Mm-hmm.
and trees.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
it's very beautiful. And I'm going to pause right here for a second and I'm going to
Yeah.
find it and bring it up for you. So hold on
Sure, sure, sure. Yeah.
a screen. So I'm going to share screen here. This is the visual summary of Wolfram physics. So if you can see up here in the upper left-hand corner, there's a rule. So the universe starts with a rule. And there's if the rule originally has these two edges, it has three nodes and two edges. So these nodes would be called eames. And the edges would be the relationship between the eames. So at the updating of event, the very first event would be to take this blue relationship, this blue edge, and change that blue edge into another, adding another node in the center, and now all the edges relate to that node in the center. So you're going from a unity of three here, which is very interesting,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to a beginning with now we have three again.
Yeah.
Well, so if you take this sequence of updating events and you begin with an initial condition, it kind of depends on what your initial condition is when you update the events.
Mm-hmm.
But these are possibilities here, over here on the left.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, this spatial hypergraph starts to look like something like this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he can take this, that space and matter are emergent features of the hypergraph,
Mm-hmm.
and elementary particles are localized, persistent structures in the hypergraph,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
like little knots almost in the
Yeah.
hypergraph.
Yep.
And
Yep.
then this big thing in the middle is that these these different states of the universe can have different causal paths. And the causal paths, the causal flux is actually what energy is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so there's many different ways to parse this out. There's the multi-way states and causal graph. There's the branchial graph, which is at any point, if you took, at any point in time, if you slice across this set of multi-way causal graphs, and you're going to get where all the eames are at any point in time,
Mm-hmm.
that's this branchial graph.
Sure. Yep.
You can see that over here as well.
Sure.
You slice
Sure.
across all these eames, and you can see
Yep.
at any point in time where things stand.
Sure.
But time is always updating these events.
Sure.
So that sounded very much to me like what you were just saying,
Yep.
with the material and the intellectual
Yep.
relating to space and time. And it's also very, very close to Matthew Pageau's
Mm-hmm.
teaching about space and time in his book, which I'm
Yep.
assuming you've read because it sounds as though
Yep.
you
Yeah, it's a
have.
marriage of the two. I think it's probably right because there's a lot of convergence on this. Like, there's a lot of convergence on this from a lot of different perspectives. You can make this argument from a lot of different perspectives. That, I mean, so it's kind of like, we're embedded in the thing. So whenever we're talking about God, or whenever we're abstracting, whenever we're pushing up the mountain, whenever we're building Mount Sophia, as it were, um, and we're climbing around on it, we're trying to find the way. Once you get up to the top, it seems like we're kind of getting toward the point where there's a lot of people pointing to the top now. It used to be only a few, and they were kind of treacherous and were quite difficult to follow. Um, and now there's a lot more. I think that's a good way to talk about it. When you get to the top, what the top looks like, um, it always ends up being some kind of three resolving into one.
Mm-hmm.
It always ends up being a unity that's held up by by a triangle, as it were, that is somehow only existent in the flow between those. That's certainly the Christian model, which is an
And
incredibly
the
deep.
one, do you see the one as being kind of above the top of the mountain so that you can't actually reach it?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's you never actually really get to the one exactly. Like
Hmm.
one is the only way you can talk about it, but in the three, becoming one, being and non-being become the same thing. And so it gets to be space that you can't speak about. There's a weird way in which you can experience it. You can know what it is by being it, but you can't talk about it. You can't put it into propositions exactly because it's beyond being.
Well,
Um,
Chris Wilson is a mathematician who talks about calculus as being this beautiful picture of the asymptotic nature of the one and the many, and because the one is approached by the asymptote, but can never meet. But it's always this, you're going up the mountain, but you can't quite meet. So you already get closer, 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 but you can't quite meet it.
yeah, and this is actually, this is a place to maybe talk about something I've been working with a little bit, and this is where I'm trying to get to. John and I just had another conversation. I'm hopeful it'll come out maybe the end of this week. He'll post it, but where I'm hoping to eventually get with John, we have to build a lot of language together first, and we're kind of just working on that now. But there's the Neoplatonic understanding of God is or the one. Most of the understandings of the one, um, of the non-dual space, in many ways will stop there. That's the totality. And I think what the particular one of the particular things about Christianity, now there's a few, mostly it's Christ, but the particular thing about the Godhead aspect of Christianity that seems to be maybe a little bit different, and I may be wrong about this. This is just from what I have seen from my explorations, is that St. Maximus talks about, he uses the Neoplatonic understanding of the many and the one a lot. I think he's probably one of the most brilliant of the Neoplatonists, honestly, but I don't know if that's wrong to say. Um, but what he postulates is that after you have the totality of the one, the Godhead is also beyond the space of being and non-being. So God is not just the being and non-being, although I think he is, but there's also something, or at least there might be something beyond that. And I think that's actually a wise thing to postulate and hold as the model, right? Because again, it's the model. It's not perfect. It can't be. But I think to hold open the possibility that beyond the space of non-being and being, there still might be something, um, or just that isn't necessarily the end. There's something about the humility. There's an aspect of humility that's with that I think is possibly helpful.
Yes, which I would love to talk with you again about sometime, that aspect of humility. That opens up another whole line of conversation, but I have to sign off. So,
Yes, yes, of course. Well, thanks for talking. This was fun.
yeah, yeah, I wish we didn't have to stop so abruptly. I have something that I made a commitment to, though, and I have to keep my commitment. So,
Yeah, of course, no problem.
yeah. Thank you
Yeah,
so much. I look forward to having another opportunity to talk about this. You can help me get language for my project, and maybe it will help you get language for your project with John. By the
indeed.
way, I'm having John on next week, and he's going to be having a conversation with Wolfgang Smith. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
I don't think so.
He is a brilliant physicist and philosopher, 92 years old, filled with all kinds of wisdom, who has a theory that he calls vertical causality.
Okay,
And I thought it would be fun to get him and John together and see what they could hammer out.
that
So
sounds awesome.
if
Great.
you have any questions that you think would be interesting to ask John in that conversation, just drop me a line.
Sure. Yeah. Awesome.
And people in the comments, if you have any questions you'd like to have me ask John, let me know. Okie dokie. Well, thank you so much, Ken. This has been fascinating. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Yeah. Bye bye.